January 17th, 1945, Rouen, France. The morning is the color of old tin-low cloud, thin light, and a cold that seems to climb into the bones through wet wool. A convoy yard stretches behind a line of warehouses podded by shrapnel, its mud glazed with frost and spilled fuel. Canvas tarps snap in the wind. A generator coughs, then settles into a steady drone. Somewhere beyond the city, artillery speaks in muffled syllables, far enough away to be almost ignored, close enough to keep everybody tense. A field kitchen sits like a small island of warmth at the edge of the yard. Men and women in American uniforms move past it in a practiced flow, cups in hand. The coffee is dark and steaming, and the smell of it bitter, sharp, unmistakably alive, cuts through diesel fumes like a memory of home. Near the gate, under guard, a cluster of female prisoners stands with their coats pulled tight, hair pinned back, eyes hollowed by months of retreat. They have learned to stare without pleading. They have learned to hide surprise, because surprise is a weakness that can be used against them. But then the yard shifts, and so does the world. A line of trucks begins to roll 2.5s, and heavier, each one loaded with crates, tires, ammunition boxes, fuel drums, parts. The engines rumble, chains scrape, gears bite, and as the vehicles pass, the prisoners' eyes rise to the cabs. Women are driving. Not as passengers, not as decorations, not as nurses clinging to the side, but hands on the wheel, eyes forward, boots braced, shoulders squared, easing the weight of American industry into motion. One of the prisoners tightens her jaw as if to stop a word from escaping. Another blinks hard and looks away, then looks back as though the image might correct itself. A third young, skeletal stares at the driver's hands, the way someone might stare at a miracle or an insult. They had been told America was weak. They had been told American women were frivolous. They had been told democracy produced softness, that it dissolved discipline, that it could not endure the iron demands of total war. And now, in the mud of a French depot, those lessons are dissolving quietly, without ceremony, into the steam rising from a cup of coffee and the sound of a truck shifting into gear. This is not a single story. It is a pattern repeated across continents, across camps and depots, across the long war years when the Axis powers met not only American soldiers, but American capacity, industrial, logistical, and social. For enemy prisoners, the shock was often not the gunfire. It was the ordinary. Because the ordinary in America was abundant, and abundance, when it is organized, when it arrives on time, when it does not collapse under strain, becomes a kind of argument no propaganda can answer. In the Second World War, the United States did not simply raise armies. It built a machine to feed them, move them, repair them, and replace them. And inside that machine, American women wore uniforms and did jobs that were not supposed to exist under fascist imagination. The Women's Army Corps, the WWII, was created as the women's branch of the U.S. Army, and during the war, 150,000 women served in it. Their work ranged across non-combat roles, switchboard operators, mechanics, bakers, and more, spreading into the spaces where war is actually won: logistics, communication, and sustainment. For German and Japanese ideologues, the idea of women moving heavy vehicles and managing military machinery was not just unusual, it was evidence in their minds of cultural decay. The Nazi state framed womanhood as duty to home and race. Imperial Japan leaned on hierarchy, tradition, and the belief that order meant fixed roles. Both systems taught that modern democracies were chaotic and morally loose, and that such looseness would show itself in collapse when tested. So when enemy women and men entered American custody, they often carried a specific expectation: harshness, humiliation, perhaps revenge. And when they crossed into American rear areas, they expected the victors to be coarse and undisciplined. Instead, many encountered procedures, rules, and most unsettling of all, coffee. Coffee offered in a tin cup in a captured warehouse. Coffee served in a POW compound. Coffee appearing at the same hour each day, as if the war could not interrupt it. A prisoner might be starving, shivering, and terrified, and still the American guard would hand over a cup and move on, because the system required it, because the ration scale existed, because the kitchen truck arrived, because the fuel had been delivered, because the supply chain had not broken. For people raised on the belief that the enemy was primitive, this was a psychological injury more complex than any beating. It was a wound to certainty. The women in Rouen had not arrived there as soldiers of a grand cause. They arrived as survivors of a collapsing world. Auxiliaries, clerks, signal staff, factory workers pressed into uniform, camp personnel. Women swept up at rail yards and roadblocks as the Western Front convulsed after the failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. They had been told that capture meant degradation, that Americans would treat them like spoils. They had prepared themselves to endure brutality. They had not prepared themselves to watch a calm American woman guide a heavy truck through mud with professional ease, then climb down and accept a steaming cup of coffee from a field kitchen, as if this were simply another day's work. That is what made it so powerful. It was not a performance. No one paused to prove a point. No one called a photographer. The convoy moved because the war demanded it, and this is the first truth the prisoners began to understand. Even if they could not yet admit it, America did not need to prove itself with cruelty. It proved itself with motion. The war that Germany and Japan had launched was supposed to be decided by will and ideology, by the superior spirit, by discipline, by the ruthless clarity of authoritarian command. The democracies, in their telling, were decadent and divided. They would fracture under pressure. But war is not decided by speeches. It is decided by tonnage. It is decided by how many trucks can run each night without breaking down, how many tires can be replaced, how many miles a convoy can travel, how many engines can be repaired, how many letters can still reach a soldier far from home, how many meals can still appear at dawn even when the roads are wrecked. And this is where the United States made its most quiet, relentless impact. It turned abundance into a weapon. The Women's Army Corps was part of that conversion. The WWII was not created because America suddenly discovered an ideological love for equality in wartime. It was created because the Army needed bodies, and because a nation that could mobilize its women could expand its effective strength. The WWII's non-combat labor freed men for combat roles while ensuring the Army's administrative and logistical organs kept functioning. In 1942, the War Department selected Fort Des Moines as the site for a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps Officer Training Center, one of the earliest institutional steps in transforming civilian women into military personnel capable of operating within Army structure. Do an Axis prisoner. These facts were invisible at first. They did not know the training pipelines, the doctrine debates, the administrative friction. They only saw the output. Women in uniform doing work that had been declared impossible. In Rouen, the prisoners were marched along the yard under guard to a temporary holding area, an empty section of a warehouse, straw on the floor, a barrel stove in the corner. Their hands were inspected, their pockets searched. They waited for the next humiliation that usually followed defeat. Instead, a young American corporal walked past and set a crate down near the stove. On it were a few tin cups and a pot. A ladle clinked against metal. Coffee poured out in dark streams. The prisoners stared as if the liquid might be poisoned or symbolic or a trick. Their world had taught them to suspect generosity as manipulation. They had been trained to see kindness as weakness or deceit. But the American corporal did not watch their faces for gratitude. She did not lecture them. She did not smile for effect. She simply moved down the line, cup by cup, as if fulfilling a checklist. For the prisoners, this was not only strange, it was destabilizing, because under their regimes, power flowed downward in fear. In such systems, the defeated are supposed to suffer. The suffering is part of the moral architecture. It proves the victor's dominance and the loser's worthlessness. But here, in an American depot, the defeated were being warmed by coffee, while American women drove trucks outside, and the prisoners could not reconcile these realities with what they had been told. In their minds, American women had existed only as myth, either decadent actresses or helpless victims. The idea that American women would be given authority, would be entrusted with machinery, would function within military discipline, contradicted the image of the enemy as morally broken. So the prisoners searched for explanations that could preserve their worldview. Some assumed the women drivers were rare exceptions, oddities. Others told themselves it was staged for propaganda, a cruel theater designed to humiliate them. But the convoy yard did not behave like a stage. It behaved like a machine. Women moved between vehicles with grease on their hands and clipboards under their arms. They checked oil, pressure, chains. They guided reversing trucks with hand signals precise as drill. They did not seek attention. They sought efficiency. This was the emotional contrast at the heart of the prisoners' shock. They expected to see a nation of softness, but they were watching a nation of organized labor. And now the deeper story begins, because the image of women driving trucks was not simply about gender. It was about what kind of society could survive total war. The Axis powers had built systems meant to produce obedience. They could mobilize quickly, command ruthlessly, and silence dissent. They could concentrate effort. But such systems also depended on rigid hierarchy and enforced roles. They demanded that life fit ideology. America demanded something different, that ideology fit life. The United States could argue endlessly about politics, but once mobilized, it could harness private industry and civic institutions into mass production. It could adapt, it could improvise, and it could do so without collapsing into one rigid social mold. When the army needed drivers, it trained drivers. When it needed clerks, it trained clerks. When it needed mechanics, it trained mechanics. And when it needed women to fill roles previously reserved for men, it often grudgingly, often imperfectly made room. The prisoners did not know the debates in Washington. They did not know the recruiting posters and the internal resistance. They only saw the consequence, a society capable of widening its own definition of usefulness under pressure. Outside the warehouse, a truck stalled in mud. Its rear tires spun, spraying slush. A woman in an American uniform climbed down, grabbed a length of chain, and coordinated with another driver. They laid boards. They pushed. The engine roared. The truck lurched free. The prisoners watched, silent. And somewhere inside them, an old certainty shifted. Perhaps the enemy was not collapsing. Perhaps the enemy was learning. The cup of coffee warmed their hands. The steam fogged their faces, and in that fog, memory returned, memories of their own kitchens back home. Empty shelves, ration cards, thin soup. They remembered the last winter before capture, when coffee had been replaced with substitutes, when sugar vanished, when bread shrank. Here, coffee was real, and it was given without ceremony. That was the second truth beginning to dawn. This enemy could afford to be generous, not because it was sentimental, but because it had the capacity. And capacity is the foundation of power. In the United States, the logistical engine extended from home front factories to overseas depots. The coffee in that cup was not just coffee. It represented shipping lanes, port facilities, rail networks, warehouses, procurement systems, layers of organization that made the simple possible. For a prisoner who had been told America was a chaotic democracy, the most frightening revelation was that democracy could be systematic. It could be industrial. It could be disciplined. And the proof was not a speech. It was a hot cup in the cold. The women prisoners were not alone in experiencing such cognitive shock. Across POW camps and occupied zones, Axis prisoners encountered American material depth and procedural habits that conflicted with their propaganda. Even in the United States itself, records and summaries of German POW life describe adequate food and routine breakfasts with cereal and toast, lunches with pork and vegetables, often prepared by German cooks using US-supplied ingredients, an everyday abundance that contrasted sharply with the collapse of rations in wartime Germany. But the story here is not only about food. It is about what food and coffee symbolize. Under dictatorship, scarcity becomes policy. Under total war, scarcity becomes control. A regime can use hunger as leverage. It can create dependency. It can punish disobedience by withholding what people need. In the American system, at least in its own self-image and often in practice, abundance was linked to a different idea. That the state existed to organize redies my doc, not to hoard them for the privileged alone. This is not romantic. America had its own inequalities, its own contradictions. But to an Axis prisoner, the fact that an enemy could feed them at all, could give them coffee, felt like the collapse of a central assumption that power must always be cruel. And then there was the other collapse, the assumption that women must always be subordinate. In their former world, many of these prisoners had seen women punished for stepping outside prescribed roles. They had been taught that war belonged to men, that machinery belonged to men, that authority belonged to men. Even when women worked in factories, the ideology insisted it was temporary, unnatural, and subordinate. But here, women wore the same uniform pattern, carried the same rank markings, and operated the same vehicles. The prisoners did not see a feminist manifesto. They saw a functioning logistical system, and that is why it struck so deeply. It was not an argument, it was evidence. As the day in Rouen progressed, the prisoners were moved again toward a transport line that would send them deeper behind Allied lines. They passed a motor pool where mechanics worked beneath raised hoods. One truck had its engine compartment open, steam rising from the radiator. A woman in uniform leaned in with a wrench, jaw set, hair tucked away. A male soldier stood beside her, reading from a manual or checklist. They worked as colleagues. There was no ceremony of deference. The prisoner's eyes followed the wrench as if it were a forbidden object, not because a wrench is powerful, but because it represents competence. And competence, to authoritarian ideology, is supposed to flow in predictable directions along lines of gender, race, and class dictated by doctrine. This wrench moved in a different world. The prisoners' minds reached for explanation again. Perhaps America was so desperate it had to use women this way, they told themselves. But the yard did not look desperate. It looked supplied. It looked organized. It looked like a place where even the mud had been measured, mapped, and managed as best as possible. And that is when the most unsettling thought crept in. Perhaps this was not desperation at all. Perhaps it was strength. Perhaps the ability to employ women in military roles, to train them, to integrate them. Perhaps that was what strength looked like under democracy. The prisoners were loaded into a truck, ironically, driven by a man this time under guard. The truck bounced along the rutted road. Their hands were cold around their cups. The coffee cooled quickly, but its bitterness lingered. As they passed through Rouen's damaged streets, they saw American signs posted on walls, American MPs directing traffic, American vehicles lined up with endless repetition, trucks, jeeps, ambulances. The sheer number of them felt unreal. For people raised in a world of shortage by 1944, the abundance itself seemed obscene. They had been taught that democracies waste, that here, waste had been converted into supply. The prisoners remembered their own armies, fuel shortages, worn tires, horses replacing trucks, trains bombed, roads clogged with refugees, retreating units fighting for scraps of transport. In the Ardennes, German forces had launched their last great gamble in December 1944, relying on speed and surprise. But speed requires fuel. Surprise requires momentum, and momentum requires logistics. America's response, the rapid movement of men and material, was itself a logistical feat, a demonstration that the Allied system could absorb shock, redeploy, and continue. The prisoners did not know those operational details. They felt them as atmosphere, the sense that the Americans had depth, that even when struck, they did not crumble. They shifted and kept going, and in that depth, women driving trucks were not anomalies. They were part of the depth. The truck carrying the prisoners turned into a camp area, perhaps a temporary holding compound. Barbed wire, guard towers, signs in English. They were processed, assigned, counted. Then again coffee, a cup offered, a pot steaming, a ladle hitting the rim with a metallic ring. The prisoners' reactions were muted, but inside them, something was changing. The coffee had become a recurring fact of captivity, and recurring facts are dangerous to propaganda. Propaganda relies on rarity and spectacle. It relies on controlled images. It cannot easily withstand repetition of ordinary contradiction. You can dismiss one kind act as a trick. You cannot easily dismiss a pattern that repeats daily. It begins to feel like a system. And systems reshape belief. One of the prisoners, older, perhaps in her 30s or 40s, had spent the war years absorbing state doctrine until it felt like physics. She had been told what America was, a place of moral decay and weakness. She had believed it because belief was safer than doubt. Doubt in authoritarian states is a form of disloyalty, and disloyalty is punished. Now doubt was not punished. It was simply born. It was born in the sight of an American woman walking the perimeter with a rifle slung in routine posture. It was born in the sight of an American woman directing a vehicle column. It was born in the taste of coffee. And as doubt grew, so did the painful question. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? This is the transformation that enemy prisoners often experienced. Not necessarily a conversion to American ideology, but a fracture in the sealed certainty of their own. In many cases, it was not that they suddenly loved democracy. It was that they realized the authoritarian promise of inevitability was false. Authoritarian regimes claim they are natural. They claim they reflect timeless truth. They claim their order is the only possible order. But here was a different order. Messy, plural, imperfect, and functioning. A woman could drive a truck. A woman could wear rank. A prisoner could be given coffee. These were not philosophical arguments. They were facts. The prisoners slept that night in cold barracks with straw and blankets. The war's distant sound continued beyond the wire engines, trains, occasional artillery. The camp light flickered. In the morning, the process resumed. Count, food, work assignments for those who could be used, movement orders, and again, coffee. For American personnel, coffee was a routine part of the day's rhythm. A tool against fatigue, a comfort. For prisoners, coffee became a symbol of something far larger, a society able to provide small comforts even when stretched across oceans. In Europe, the Allies were not only fighting battles, they were building a temporary civilization behind the front. Roads repaired, depots established, mail delivered, kitchens set up, a vast mobile infrastructure. And women were part of it. The National Park Service's account of the WWII emphasizes the range of non-combat jobs women performed, from mechanics to bakers, roles that kept the army running. That matter-of-fact phrasing, jobs, duties, service undersells the emotional force of what it meant to the enemy to see those roles filled by women. Because for the Axis ideologies, gender roles were tied to the moral legitimacy of the state. To see those roles undone by the enemy was to see the enemy as a rival, not only militarily but socially, and rivalry at that level can become existential. It threatens the idea that your world is the only possible world. Weeks passed. Some prisoners were transported to larger compounds, some to the United States, some held in Europe. The specifics varied, but the pattern remained. They encountered American organization. They saw American warehouses stacked high. They saw American vehicles in numbers that made the mind numb. They saw American women in uniform, sometimes in clerical lines, sometimes in communications rooms, sometimes driving. They heard the American habit of procedure, forms, stamps, lists. The Axis had promised triumph through will. But will cannot replace rubber, gasoline, spare parts, trained personnel. Will cannot replace the slow, grinding reality of logistics. For the prisoners, the American war machine looked less like a heroic army and more like a factory that had learned to move. And women were part of the factory. In some corners of the war, women did extraordinary things under extraordinary conditions. In Alaska, Rusty Dow's story driving mail trucks through blizzards, becoming the first woman to drive the full length of the Alaska Highway in 1944 with 5 tons of cement, illustrates both the skepticism she faced and the recognition she earned. The official vignette notes that at first there were many skeptics that a woman could fill this man's job, but she persisted and proved them wrong through performance. That skepticism existed in America too. But that is part of the point. A society can contain prejudice and still adapt under necessity. Adaptation does not require perfection. It requires flexibility. In authoritarian systems, ideology is brittle. It cannot easily bend without breaking because bending admits error, and error admits weakness. In the American system, bending could be framed as pragmatism, and pragmatism could become policy. So the prisoners watched women do men's work, and the world did not end. The sky did not fall. The trucks still ran. The war still moved forward. And that, perhaps more than any lecture about democracy, challenged their old worldview. For some, the experience produced resentment. They felt humiliated by defeat and by the unfamiliar moral atmosphere of captivity. For others, it produced a kind of quiet curiosity they could not express openly. For a few, it planted a seed that would later grow into rejection of the ideologies they had served. But the transformation was rarely dramatic. It was usually slow, private, and painful. It happened in the mind at night when the camp was quiet and the prisoner could not escape her own thoughts. She remembered the speeches that promised victory. She remembered the slogans that promised a new order. She remembered how those slogans had explained everything until reality contradicted them. Now reality was an American woman in a truck cab, hands steady on the wheel. Reality was a cup of coffee pressed into cold hands without ceremony. And reality has a way of eroding slogans like water erodes stone not all at once, but inevitably. By spring 1945, the war in Europe collapsed rapidly. Cities fell. Units surrendered, camps filled with prisoners. The scale of defeat overwhelmed the old language of ideology. For prisoners, the end of the war did not immediately bring freedom. It brought waiting, it brought bureaucracy, it brought uncertainty, it brought long days of labor and long nights of thinking. And in the American camps, the routine continued. Roll calls, rations, medical checks, work details, and the recurring presence of coffee, sometimes real, sometimes rationed, but often enough to remain a symbol. For an Axis prisoner who had lived through scarcity, the fact that the Americans could provide coffee at all felt like an accusation. It accused the Axis leadership of failure. It accused the ideology of incompetence. It accused the promises of inevitability of being hollow. There is a reason prisoners sometimes fixate on food and small comforts. In captivity, the world shrinks. A cup, a blanket, a piece of bread, these become the boundaries of existence. And yet these small objects carry the weight of entire systems behind them. Coffee, especially, carries an invisible map. Plantations, shipping, industry, procurement, distribution, fuel, trucks, drivers. Every cup implies an ocean crossed and a chain unbroken. The prisoners may not have known the chain's details, but they felt the chain's power. They felt it in their hands, warming them. They felt it in the bitter taste on their tongues, and they felt it in the way American women moved through the camp and depot spaces with authority that did not need to announce itself. The prisoners had expected American women to be absent from the machinery of war. Instead, American women were part of the machinery. And the machinery did not pause. In the months after Germany's surrender, the prisoners' world became a kind of limbo between ideologies. The old regime had collapsed. The new world was not yet clear. In that limbo, the sight of American women doing military work remained lodged in memory. Some prisoners later returned home carrying that memory like contraband, a memory that could not easily be spoken aloud in devastated post-war societies, still trying to make sense of shame. But memory does not require permission. It persists. And it shapes. Imagine one of those women years later, back in a ruined German city, waiting in a line for rationed goods. The buildings are broken. The men are gone or damaged. The old slogans are discredited, but their echoes remain in older generations. In that line, she smells not coffee but thin soup. She hears not engines but rubble shifting underfoot. And then, unbidden, her mind returns to ruin the depot yard, the trucks, the American woman driver, the cup of coffee steaming in winter air. That memory becomes a kind of silent comparison between worlds, one that promised greatness and delivered scarcity, and one that was ridiculed as decadent yet delivered abundance even in war. In that comparison, ideology loses its grip, not because the prisoner becomes an American in her heart, but because she learns that the world is larger than her regime's story. That is the deeper transformation, the widening of reality beyond propaganda. In the Pacific, similar shocks occurred among Japanese prisoners and civilians encountering the American military presence. The details differed, shaped by geography and culture, but the pattern of disorientation and American material capacity and procedural conduct recurred. For any authoritarian system that relies on caricaturing its enemy, direct contact becomes dangerous, because direct contact introduces complexity. Complexity breeds doubt, and doubt is the enemy of totalitarian certainty. Return again to the image of women driving trucks and even moving among armored vehicles. The title's phrase, "driving trucks and tanks," captures the sense of disbelief. Though in the U.S. Army, women were officially excluded from direct combat roles in that era. Yet, in the chaotic spaces behind the front, the boundaries between combat and support blurred. Tanks needed fuel and maintenance. Depots needed coordination. Vehicles needed movement. Women could be present in those spaces, adjacent to armored power, part of the logistical web that made armored thrust possible. To prisoners, the nuance did not matter. They saw women in proximity to armored might, and they interpreted it as women participating in war's machinery. That perception alone was enough to shake the ideological frame, because ideology relies on the perception of natural order. And what looks natural is what one has been trained to accept. In America, the war trained people to accept new realities. Women in uniform, women driving, women operating within army structure. And the war forced the enemy to witness it. The recurring symbol of coffee threads through the entire arc for a reason. It is the perfect emblem of American wartime abundance. Not because coffee is extravagant, but because it is consistent. It is predictable. It is ordinary. Dictatorships can command sacrifice. They can demand hunger and call it virtue. They can glorify deprivation as purity. But deprivation is still deprivation. Hunger still hurts. Cold still bites. And war without supply still collapses. Democracy, when it can organize its abundance, can sustain not only armies but routines. It can keep the small rituals alive. It can keep the coffee hot. For the prisoners, the coffee was a strange mercy, but also a strange indictment. It suggested that America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its ability to keep life functioning under pressure, and that is what they could not believe. Not only that women were driving trucks, but that the system around those women was so deep, so organized, so well-fed that it could afford to let them. It could afford to expand roles. It could afford to break old rules. It could afford to survive change. In the final weeks of the war, as surrender flags appeared and the gunfire faded, the prisoners' minds faced a new terror. What would remain of their old beliefs when the institutions enforcing them were gone? Some clung to ideology like driftwood. Others let it sink quietly. Most lived somewhere between, trying to rebuild a self from ruins. But many carried one memory that was stubbornly concrete. A cold day. A muddy yard. A convoy of trucks. An American woman at the wheel. A cup of coffee in their hands. It is easy, from a distance, to treat such moments as anecdotes, small curiosities at the edge of grand history. But history is not only made in conference rooms and battle maps. It is also made in the private collapse of certainty. When a prisoner sees a reality that contradicts her upbringing, that is history entering the mind. When she cannot unsee it, that is history changing the future. Because after the war, the world rebuilt not only cities, but ideas. The old fascist certainties were discredited, but new conflicts began, new ideologies rose, new borders hardened. In that rebuilding, the memory of American capacity of a system that could fight a global war and still produce coffee, still put women in uniforms and keep the machine moving became part of the post-war myth of American power. But it was not purely myth. It was experienced. It was tasted. It was heard in the steady sound of engines. And it was seen in a woman's hands on a steering wheel. If there is one larger truth that rises from this story, it is that freedom is not only a moral claim. It is a practical capability. It is the ability of a society to adapt without shattering, to mobilize without becoming a single iron prison, to build systems that deliver the ordinary even in extraordinary times. The prisoners believed democracy meant weakness. What they encountered was something else. Democracy as abundance organized into motion. A cup of coffee served on schedule. A truck rolling out on time. A woman driving in as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps that was the most frightening, most hopeful lesson of all, depending on who was watching. Because when a society can make such things ordinary, it can make many other things possible. Not perfection, not purity, but possibility. And in the long shadow of war, possibility is a form of power no dictatorship can fully control. The engines fade down the road. The depot returns to its routine. The coffee pot empties and is filled again. The prisoners sit with the taste lingering, bitter and warm. And somewhere inside them, a crack in ideology widens into a seam. History does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives quietly in winter air in the hands of an enemy woman, offering coffee without hatred while another enemy woman watches American women driving the machines that will carry the war to its end. 2.